Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on this episode we're going to take this engine using this engine lift and put it in this car. Alright, so now to get started, what we need to do is make sure that the engine bay is prepped and ready for the motor to go in before we get to anything else. Now, you should be able to see here, I have my two CV joints ready and prepped in place, ready to be put in. Now, these CV joints have the axles connected to them already. Now the reason you're going to want to put these axles in, especially this type of axle beforehand, this is going to provide you the ease of simply sliding those pot joints directly into the differential. But you also need to have some free space down here for these axles to kind of sit off to the side so that the motor can sit down in where it needs to go nice and easy. Now, additionally, you probably see I've got a lot of hosing and wiring and things like that. So what we're going to want to do now is kind of pull all this stuff up off to the side. We want it out of the way so that it's not in the way of the motor actually going down into the space it needs to go to. Now, one thing you're going to want to make sure that you pull up right now is the speedo cable. Obviously going to want to get the rest of this hosing and stuff up out of the way, but this one's very important because we're going to actually connect this before the motor drops all the way down into the space here, because this needs to connect to the actual speedo housing on your transmission, which can be a little hard to get to if the motor is in already. So there we have it. All of our wires and hosing are out of the way. All right, so now that that's up all out of the way, we're in good shape to do this. Now, one thing that I want to show you guys, on my car, I have a totally vertical hood lift system. This is made by Minovation. I love it. It has made this job and really every job that I have underneath the hood really easy to do. But if you don't have a vertical hood lift system, you are going to need to take off your hood in order to get this engine back in. My guess is that you probably already have the hood off if you've got the motor out, but if you don't, just take these 4 nuts off and the hood kind of just, these brackets pop off and then you can lift it up out of the engine bay. But anyways, let's get the motor prepped and ready to lift. So the last thing that we got to do before we drop this sucker in is just get this prepped and ready for lifting. So there are a few things you're going to want to check real quick before it goes back in. Make sure that you have your hose on the back side of the radiator connected. That thing is a bastard to put in if you don't do it ahead of time like I did. You're going to want to add the 2 engine mounts, the one on this side over here with the clutch cover and clutch housing, and then you're also going to want to add the engine mount on the other side underneath the radiator. But with that, I'm going to use my lifting method, which for me, I have special eyelets that mount directly into the spark plug holes. But the original mounts, the original engine lift mounts that were used on the Classic Mini actually mounted to these head studs, the one on the right and the left. So if you do want to mount this yourself, I think that that is probably the safest place to do it. But I have also been using the spark plug mount holes and it's been fine up until this point. So hopefully that will maintain through this drop, and we'll go ahead and put it in the car here. All right, so the next thing that we're doing here is really just lining up this engine to make sure that it lowers down in the right way. Now, we are going to want to go really slow, really slow, because we're not going to want to impact anything. We're not going to want to scratch the hood, the body of the car. We want this to go as smoothly as it possibly can go. Now the key, while this motor is being set down in here, is to find and line up these 2 holes on each side of your subframe with the actual engine mount. And this can be a little bit difficult with a super heavy motor. And really the easiest way to do this is with a friend and having them lifting and lowering and lifting and lowering until you can kind of get that to a sweet spot where you want it to be. But that's not always an option. So in this scenario, I'm going to be kind of working this around until we can find a sweet spot and set this sucker down. So it's time to celebrate. This motor is back in the car. It is super exciting. But the next thing that we're gonna need to do is start connecting our drive shafts. Now, what we're looking at is the back side of the motor here. That is the differential down there, and we're gonna need to reconnect our drive shaft, which is that right there. And then there's one off screen over here. But as Tom on Total Car Reviews found out, you need a C-clip in order to attach these things. And if you don't have the C-clip on these drive spindles, which are these units right here, then the pot joints aren't going to click in and stay on those drive shafts. So on my car, I put those on prior to, but they're super easy to set on there. Literally just wrap around the output shaft and you can just slide it around the side of it. But I'm going to jump under the car and connect these drive shafts. All right, so once you have those drive shafts connected, the next thing that we're going to be looking at here is the whole kind of suspension assembly. I want to get those hubs in. Getting the hub in and getting the wheel connected is going to make it a lot easier for us to spin over our motor while we're working on it. Some people wait to do this until after they've connected up more of the actual motor itself. But for my purposes and what I feel more comfortable with, I'm going to go ahead and connect up the hub and everything. Now, as you can see here, a lot of parts have already been reinstalled, specifically the tie rod end, my lower control arm, and then my steering rod end. I went ahead and reconnected all of this stuff already because there isn't really a whole lot to it. There will have to be a lot of adjustment, specifically from an alignment shop to get all this stuff aligned properly. But as you can see, I went ahead and kind of spiced up the colors on this stuff. My friend and my coworker owns a powder coating shop. It's called Method Coatings. And he did this powder coating for me. It turned out incredible. I'm super excited about this. There's obviously some dirty parts up here and kind of around the stuff, but we got the color of some of these suspension parts to match up almost perfectly with the body color of my car. And I think this is just going to be some nice details down here that are going to make this look really good. So the next thing that we're going to be doing here is reconnecting the drive shaft assembly, the constant velocity joint or the CV joint that goes on the drive shaft right down here. As you can see, there is a small C-clip on this as well. This holds on that CV joint that actually mounts into your hub. But just a quick recap of how this stuff goes in. There is a single bolt on the end here. You put your 2 bushings on the end. Then this mounts to your lower control arm. There's an adjustment here if you do have an adjustable tie rod that's like reinforced, it's stronger. I strongly recommend upgrading that. This lower control arm also, if I remember correctly, the stock one isn't adjustable, but don't quote me on that, I'm not totally certain, but there is your adjustment nut here, and then your locking nut up at the top here. Now, this is gonna be out of whack. My alignment's definitely gonna be wrong here, but that's okay. We're just gonna get this reconnected and back in the placement it should be. So let's grab that hub, and let's also grab that CV joint. Now, the way that this works is you have your CV joint, looks something like this, and it has ball bearings, ball joints inside here. This is going to lock into place over that drive shaft right there. And then this is going to pass through your hub. Your hub looks like this. And as you can see, that top is still a little loose. I'm going to have to adjust that still. But backside of your hub, I'm holding it by the connection point that connects to the steering rack. And then this mounts in here, and this slides through that hub. Pretty straightforward stuff. But it is important that this goes on in a specific order. And while you're putting the stuff back together, it's a really, really good time to go ahead and replace the boots that go on the back side of this. So this is going to slide over the drive shaft here, and this is going to connect to your CV joint. Now, there are a few different ways you can connect this. The one that I strongly recommend using are metal C-clamps like this. 7 Mini Parts sells this kit. This is actually a kit for a more modern car, but it fits our classic Minis perfectly. And this rubber is really, really thick, high quality rubber. So if you're looking to replace these boots, if you've noticed you have a lot of grease or the stuff needs to be replaced, check out 7 Mini Parts. They do have an awesome, awesome kit. Comes with everything you need to replace this. The 2 band clamps, and then a new C-clip, which will go on our drive shaft here. Now, getting those C-clamps off is not as easy as getting them on, in my opinion. Getting them on, they just kind of slide around here, around that drive shaft and into place. But getting them off can be a little difficult. There we go, got our new C-clamp. And what you can see here, and one of the reasons you want to replace these, actually it might be a little hard to see, but the C-clamp itself sticks out farther, and what that means is it's sprung. It's got a lot more strength to it that is going to grab that CV joint a lot tighter. So now once that's on, we're going to go ahead and slide our boot over this. Now once you've got that boot on, which as you can see was a little difficult, but it wasn't too bad, the next step is to go ahead and grease up your CV joint. Now, if you get the 7 mini parts kit, this is going to come with grease. It's going to come in a nice little tube here, and you are going to want to use all of this grease. You want this super packed, you want it super, super greasy. Keeping in mind the fact that the reason you want it so greasy is because this joint right here is spinning 100% of the time that your wheel is spinning. All right, and once you have that all greased, as you can see, there's a nice helping of grease in there. You are simply going to try and line up the splines here and push this on. Now, if it doesn't go on, you might end up needing to use a hammer. I like rubber mallets because they don't damage things. All right, so now once you have that boot covering and just over the CV joint, the next step is to actually clamp down your CV clamps. Now, these things are awesome. They work really, really well, but you have to have the right tool. Now, in some cases, you can kind of get away with using just a pair of pliers, but realistically, just go to your auto parts store. There's a special tool for CV clamps. Let's see if I can get that in frame like a goofball. And it grabs this little nibble here, and then when you squeeze it, it pulls that clamp in tight. But then when you're ready to take the clamp off, it's as simple as prying back that end there. Now, the reason these tools are so important is because it properly holds this while it squeezes it down. But if you use one of these clamps and you tighten it down like this, it does not come apart. And let me tell you, zip ties, not gonna cut it here. Zip ties, wire, those things, they just fall apart and you're gonna have grease everywhere. Just take the little bit of extra time, get this kit that 7 Mini Parts sells, or if you're overseas, check out one of your local parts suppliers. They have got these, and it is just, it's night and day. So as you can see here, I grab the end of this little nibble here and I squeeze this. I'm gonna go ahead and squeeze it up. Pinch it nice and tight, just like that. And now you have a nice tight CV clamp on your CV boot. Now you can do the exact same thing to the clamp on the back here. I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And we are ready to put our hub on now. So let's go ahead and grab that. All right, so now you can see I put my disc on. I used an impact gun to just go ahead and tighten that up for right now. I am gonna have to come back and torque that down. I do not wanna forget this because it's extremely important that this hub gets torqued down to the proper foot poundage. But for right now, I can't keep it from spinning because the car's not in gear and I don't have any way to stop this wheel from just whoop, spinning around. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the brakes on now. Now, as you can see here, I've got my caliper. And what I'm gonna do here, I've got no fluid in the system because it's all drained out. I went ahead and squeezed these pistons back into their placement here, and that will allow me to get the brake pads in there when I need to here in a little bit. But for right now, just gonna push the pistons back in. It might be a little tough to do. There are tools that do this, but usually you can get it by hand if you squeeze hard enough. Got those squeezed in. And now there are just 2 bolts that go on the back here and mount into the actual hub. I'm gonna go ahead and put those on now. There we go, we have 1 brake caliper on. Take a look at that, awesome. And with that, we have this end kind of connected back up. I do kind of have to work on the steering rod end here. Normally this would go in right here. but it's not going in for some reason here, so I've got to kind of, I think it's the paint, I've got to work that off a little bit, but I won't do that part on camera. You get the idea. This rod end goes in right here, and then your wheel can turn. So now we're looking at the front side of our brake system here, and as you can see, we got one pad here and a second pad that go on the other side. This is pretty straightforward. They actually just slide right in. But one thing I want to call out is that sometimes these brake pads, actually this section right here, doesn't quite fit on the back side of your braking system. So you have to shave this down in order for it to come in here. I only noticed it with these mini sport calipers. I'm not sure if that's the case with everything else, but pretty straightforward. The only other thing is that you want to install a little bit of brake part lubricant on the back side here, just a little bit on the sides as well. You don't want to get any on the pads, but you want it to be on the surfaces that rub up against each other. It's going to help make this rub and slide a little bit quieter, a little bit nicer. So there's one. And there is two. Brake pads are in. Now all that's left is the actual cotter pins, and these slide through both sets of brake pads, right through there and right through there. The same thing on the bottom ones, like that. And then we'll bend these tabs over. And that's it. We've got our brakes installed there. We'll go ahead and wipe off the excess lubricant. And now once we fill it with fluid, this will actually stop again. But for right now, it's just going to be kind of free in there, and that's totally okay. That's normal. So all that's left is repeating this on the other side, and then let's jump into the engine bay where we can start connecting some of our engine components in preparation for getting it started on maybe the next episode. So in this episode, I'm going to kind of finish up as much as I can on the front side of the motor here. You know, my oil cooler, the oil filter housing, things of that nature on the front here, specifically the starter. But as far as the distributor goes, I'm not actually going to cover that in too much detail in this video. I want to cover a timing video separately, and that's going to be kind of its own thing. I want to kind of dedicate some time to that because it can be kind of confusing for those of you who haven't done it before. In fact, it's still kind of confusing for those of us who have, aka myself. But what we will start doing now is really just attaching some of the ancillary stuff that goes on the front of the motor here. So I am going to start, I think, with the starter itself. I'm going to go ahead and put that in. Since I have all this free space right now, it's going to be the easiest time to go ahead and put that starter in. Now, after pulling this starter out, this thing is dirty. It needs a nice cleanup before it goes in here. This thing has definitely seen some better days. So I'm going to clean this up real quick. 3, 2, 1. All right, so that's a little bit better. This thing is still pretty cruddy, but I think I'm probably going to be replacing this here in the near future. So for right now, this is going to go and get put back right here on our flywheel housing, just like that, except it's going to stay. Now, one thing you're not going to want to forget when you're putting this starter on is your grounding strap. And this grounding strap is important because if you don't ground out your starter, it's not going to actually work. So this goes on right on this top bolt here. I guess you could theoretically put it on the bottom bolt as well. But this grounds out your starter so that when you go to start your car and you have power running to the back side of the starter here, this will actually spin over. Now this is something that you're going to want to make sure that it's nice and tight on there, because this is part of what, you know, starts your motor. It spins your flywheel when you're starting up your car, and if it can't perform that task properly, it's not going to be able to start your car. Now you can see me here, I'm also adding the hot lead from my battery to the starter, and that goes right on the back side here. All right, so now with those two connected, the next up is to connect our oil pressure relief valve. Now on my car, I've got an adjustable one. Let's bring this a little closer, and you can see that there. Now the way that this works is as oil pressure builds up, if there's too much pressure, this is going to get compressed down and allow oil to pass around this and pass back into the oil pump and really prevent your oil from exploding if you have too much oil pressure. Now, the The reason I have an adjustable one is because I've had some bad luck with these in the past. And I've tried the ball type, I've tried this plunger type, and at this point, this is the best combination I have found. The bad luck I had, this actually was the source of failure on my motor the last time that I had to rebuild it. Basically what happened is a piece of debris got caught on this plunger and it got pegged open, which meant that I lost all of my oil pressure and the motor was starved for oil. Ultimately that led to bearing failure, and that's why I had to take it out. So I'm very picky about this, and this allows me the full adjustment of oil pressure. Now, when this goes in, you're going to want to put this in and make sure that it's adequately lubricated here as well. So we're going to lube up the end of this very good with assembly lubricant, and then I'm going to lube up the sides inside here as well. We do not want any debris inside this thing. All right, that's nice and tight. Next up, we'll go ahead and put our oil filter housing on, and I'm gonna go ahead and prime my oil filter and put that on as well. Now, for this oil filter housing section, you will need a gasket for this, so it's important, make sure you have a gasket that you put on around this filter housing. All right, so next up, we've got the oil filter. And I use this Perolator one. It's I think that's how you pronounce it, Perolator one. And this is the PL10241 model. Now, this is available on Amazon. It's available at 7 Mini Parts. This is a great filter, and I've had really, really good luck with it. So I bought a 2-pack, one to use when I break the motor in, and then a second one to replace it with once I've run this in a little bit. Now, in order to kind of properly prime this stuff, I do like to prime the oil filter as well. And the oil that I'm using in this car is the Valvoline VR1 20 weight 50. Now, the reason I am using this oil is because it's a high zinc oil. That's going to provide a nice level of lubricant, and it's also going to be great to break in the motor. So I'm going to go ahead and fill up this filter. Now, there are a lot of conflicting opinions about whether or not you should prime an oil filter like this. I always have. Some people say, well, you should run the oil through a filter before it goes in the filter because you're effectively bypassing the filter by doing this. And yeah, that's kind of technically correct. But at the end of the day, you have an opportunity to actually see this oil before it goes in. So I don't know. It's kind of a moot point to me. Now, you may also see I'm rubbing a thin layer of oil on the top of that oil filter's rubber seal. And the reason I do that is to help prevent this from kind of seizing on there in the future. Because getting the oil filter out of the Mini is, I would not say the easiest thing to do. So now we'll go ahead, start rolling that on there. There we go. Now we have our oil filter installed and primed and ready to go. Now, one thing that we're going to want to keep in mind until we get the oil cooler on here, we're going to want to make sure that this hole right here is sealed up and isn't going to get any debris in it, because that can run the risk of adding contaminants into our oil system, which we most definitely do not want. So I'm just going to put a nice piece of masking tape over that, and that should be good for right now. All right, so next up we have our little adapter for our oil pressure system. Now, depending on the type of gauge you have, if you have the stock gauge, most likely there's just going to be a metal lead that goes in here that's actually going to connect to the light inside your dash that'll tell you the oil pressure. And that's pretty much all you'll have, and that's okay. That's what's normally on these cars, and basically what that does is as soon as there's oil pressure pushed out to this little nozzle right here, you are going to get a notification on your dash that goes away, and there's no more light there. If the light stays illuminated, it means that you don't have oil pressure. Now, on my car, I've actually omitted that light, and I've moved into a proper oil pressure gauge, and that's going to show me the exact PSI of my oil. And this is really great and really helpful, especially once you start modifying your motor. It's going to give you a glimpse into the exact oil pressure that you want in your car. Now, this little adapter here, I've also added some Teflon tape to. Now, I don't know if this is necessary, but I don't like little things to leak like this because it's always one of those things that will slow drip oil all over your motor, and then it makes it really, really dirty. And personally, I'd like to avoid that. So the way that I avoid that is by putting Teflon tape on it. Now, the hose that I have running in my gauge is also not stock. This is a braided oil pressure sensor line. That's a mouthful, but the reason I got this is it's really easy to move around the engine compartment. Normally you'd have something just like a basic copper line, and in my case I wanted this to look really nice and I wanted it to be functional. One of the most important things to me on my car is things being functional. Now the first thing we'll do is just go ahead and tighten this down onto the block. This is going to create a base for us to install our pressure line. Now for small stuff like this, I don't normally use that Milwaukee impact gun. It makes me feel a little bit better doing this stuff by hand. I just feel like I'm less likely to damage things when I do stuff by hand, you know, these little tiny things. All right, there we go. Now that's nice and tight. Next step is to install the actual line itself. Now you might be able to do this by hand for the most part, and then at the very end just tighten it by using a wrench. All right, and so the last thing that I'm going to install today is the alternator. So the alternator goes right here, right next to your radiator and everything, and it's pretty straightforward to install. You simply just need to loosen this bracket, and then the alternator should fit in pretty well right here. So I'm going to go ahead and lean that out of the way. Now, this last part can be a little frustrating, but you're going to want to make sure that you get enough tension on your belt. Now, the way that you do that is by tightening the adjustment bolt on the bottom of your alternator, and it just looks like a long piece of metal with a nut on the end of it. Generally speaking, I just pull up on the alternator while I'm tightening this down, taking care not to slip off the bolt like I did just then and cut my hand. But once that is nice and tight, you should have good tension on that belt, and that should be enough. We should be able to set that there, and it should be in good shape. All right, ladies and gentlemen, engine's in the car. We've already started kind of putting some of the stuff on the motor to get it ready to start for the very first time. We still have a little ways to go. We've got to put the distributor on, we've got to time the motor, we've got to get the shift assembly all connected up. So there's still a few things that we need to do before this motor can start up for the first time, but we've made a huge step today, and I hope that what you guys saw in this video was helpful enough for you guys to kind of tackle this yourself, or at least feel a little bit more comfortable about tackling this, you know, on your own. But if you guys have absolutely any questions, please post them in the comment section below. I'm always here to help if you do have questions, and I try to respond to those comments as fast as I can. Also, a big thank you to 7 Mini Parts. Basically 99% of the parts you're seeing me use on this car are from 7 Mini Parts. And if you guys are looking for parts for your Classic Mini and you're in North America, head over to 7ENT, that's 7ENT.com. Check out those parts. There are links in my description that actually notify them that you guys are purchasing parts from me or through me and through this channel, which provide me a little bit of kickback to help fund projects like this and to help me show you guys all the different things you can do on your Classic Mini. Also, a big thank you and a big shout out to my patrons. I did just get a brand new patron, Phil Robs. Thank you for signing up on the last video. I really appreciate the support. If you guys like what I'm doing on this channel and want to see me do more engine stuff or more mini stuff, different kinds of mini stuff, head over to patreon.com/Classic Mini DIY. Think about contributing. There's some cool perks, and you're helping fund the videos that you see me produce every day for you guys. But with that, that's it for this episode. That's it for the motor drop episode. And until next time, enjoy those minis and motor on.